you attached to some of the forecasts there?
Well, there's obviously huge uncertainty over this period heading out. The Treasury's provided a bit more detail about how far they expect to see the total size of public spending as a share of the economy falling over the next few years, and that's quite a big decline. They're making optimistic noises about debt interest, about the amount that will have to be spent on social security because unemployment looks better than expected. So what we'll need to do over the next few hours is to crunch out what that's likely to mean is left for public services against this overall flat picture for public spending overall. But it's still going to be a very, very big squeeze after the election, come what may.
Nick, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's the intriguing debate that we'll now have as to how far the parties are put under pressure to tell us more about their spending plans between now and the election. The Tory leader has effectively said, I will tell you a little bit more. They say that they would make a start, as they put it, cutting spending in this financial year, but they haven't yet specified what, other than tiny amounts, really, on government marketing budgets and advertising and so on. I expect we'll get a little bit more of that, but I think the Tories, like Labour, will simply refuse to give great details. Labour will claim it's uncertainty. The Tory will say they haven't got access to the books or the personnel. And the public, I think, will say, well, isn't that what really matters in politics, where the axe falls and who suffers?
I mean, that's the point, isn't it?
It is, but it's interesting that within the room for manoeuvre that he had, the Chancellor has actually picked some areas to spend money on, which will be hard for the Conservatives to reverse. And I think particularly what's interesting to me is that the single most expensive thing he's done in this budget is to increase the winter fuel allowance for older pensioners. That's going to cost him £600 million. I should say also, I made a mistake earlier, the fuel duty rise is going to, phasing that in, is going to cost him a bit. But those two things, and particularly the fuel allowance in a week when the Leader of the Opposition, David Cameron, was actually forced to say, we will leave fuel allowance the way it is when we inherit it. Well, the cost of the inherited fuel allowance is going to be £600 million more thanks to this budget.
Robert, in a second we'll be talking to the Chief Secretary, Liam Byrne. What do you think are the main things that the Treasury needs to answer right now? It's just an hour or so after the speech has ended, but clearly there are big questions to be asked about some of the detail here.
Well, there is. I mean, we've obviously talked among ourselves principally about, the absence of the kind of detail which, the markets want, I think the population wants, about how these substantial cuts are ultimately going to be achieved. And we really are, in a fundamental sense, none the wiser. I mean, I think what I'd be interested to know from Robert Chope, because, this is sort of meat and drink to him, is whether he believes, as the Treasury plainly does, that this slightly better outcome to tax revenues is sustainable. I'm talking to the Treasury over the last few days. They themselves certainly do believe that this better outturn on tax revenues isn't a sort of freak. But, there are reasons to believe that some of this recovery might not continue. If you look, for example, at the outturn for consumer-related taxes, VAT, for example, there's a very powerful argument which says that the great debt burden on consumers will lead to a further increase in saving by consumers, and that the outlook on the high street won't be brilliant, and that actually there may be something of a false dawn here. What's your view on that?
Well, as I say, the fact that borrowing has come in lower this year than expected, partly because of higher tax revenues, is exactly what we had predicted in January. But then we were also more pessimistic, as you say, about the growth of revenues over subsequent years. So some of that good news, as it were, would be given back. Now, there are huge uncertainties there, one of which, of course, is what is the future shape of the financial sector going to be. We're enormously reliant on that for revenues. We used to get a quarter of corporation tax revenue from the financial sector. Do we know what the financial sector is going to look like and how much revenue it is going to generate when it gets back to normal, whatever the new normal looks like? So there are huge uncertainties here. And it's also worth bearing in mind, of course, that with all these numbers, if the Conservatives win the general election, all of this will be second-guessed by Sir Alan Budd and his colleagues on the new interim Office for Budget Responsibility, this independent watchdog, before the Conservatives produce their first set of forecasts. And so that may shake up all of this picture, which may be less of a reliable guide to the task that a Conservative government thinks it confronts than a re-elected Labour one would.
Let's hold it there for a second. Robert, thank you very much for that. We're just going to get a little more response from the House of Commons. We're going to join the SNP's Angus